Hello, my dear friends. Hope everyone is well. What's the significance of a dot? Well, ordinarily, a dot is not very important. But in the Torah, everything is important, including the dots. Ordinarily, there are no dots in the Torah, but there's one word in the Torah that has dots. When Yaakov returned to his home after 20 years in exile, he ran away originally from Esav as a fugitive. Esav wanted to murder Yaakov for taking the brachos. So when Yaakov finally returns, he's frightened, he's afraid for his life and for his family. Yaakov appeases Esav. He sends him gifts and presents, and then as Esav is approaching with his army, Yaakov bows down to Esav. And Esav is overwhelmed. After all, Yaakov is his twin brother, so even though Esav hated Yaakov, by that moment, Esav was overwhelmed with feelings of love, and he ran to Yaakov, and he hugged him, and he kissed him, Vayishlach, and he kissed Yaakov, and they both cried. So on the word Vayishlach, and he kissed him, there are dots. So Rashi makes note of that there are dots over the letters of Vayishlach, and Rashi offers two explanations. First, Rashi says that even though he kissed him, it was very insincere. It was superficial. He didn't really care for Yaakov, but at that moment, he gave him a kiss, but it was not b'chol lev, it was not with a full heart. Rashi does not explain why that justifies the presence of the dots. I think it's because it indicates that it was superficial. It was like a blimp in time, one little dot. For one moment, for 1 second, Esav went ahead and he showed some feeling, but it was really with very little depth. It was just a dot. That's the first explanation of Rashi. Then Rashi says another explanation in the name of Shimon Yochai. Rashi says, halacha Esav sonei es Yaakov. There is a halacha, which means there's an immutable law of nature that Esav despises Yaakov. But at that moment, nichbaro rachamav. At that moment, when he saw Yaakov, his emotions overwhelmed him, and he kissed Yaakov b'chol libo, with a full heart. It was a sincere kiss, according to the second explanation of Rashi. According to that explanation, Rashi does not explain why there were dots over the word Vayishlach. And I mean, the first explanation I'm suggesting is because the dots means that it was insincere. But what is the reason for the dots according to the second explanation? And I'd like to offer the following thought. We often talk about the pintel yid, the center, the little central point of a Jew. That even though a Jew may have wandered away and gone astray, but there's always a way to bring the Jew back, because there's always a pintel yid. There's so many stories of Jews who became involved in things that were completely inappropriate, and they completely left the path of Yiddishkeit, and then something happened, or somebody had an influence, and they were able to turn the person around. And it was because there's always a pintel yid, that the Jewish heart is never completely destroyed, it's never defiled. There's always, at some central point, there's a nekudah, there's a point where you're able to turn from that point, you're able to rebuild and reconstruct the Jewish heart. A famous application of this idea of a pintel yid is the beautiful thought of the Chidushei Arim. The Chidushei Arim was the first Geira Rebbe, and he says, the Gemara says in Shabbos, that at the time of Chanukah, after they vanquished the Yevanim, the Greeks, so they went to the Beis HaMikdash and they wanted to relight the menorah, but all the flasks of oil were tamei, they were defiled by the Yevanim. And then they found one flask of oil, pach shemen, that had the chosam of the Kohen Gadol, that still had the seal of the Kohen Gadol. It was one pure flask, and they used that flask to light the menorah, and the menorah burned for 8 days. So the Chidushei Arim says, what's the significance of the fact that there was one flask? So he says, because there, in the Jewish heart, the word shemen, ha-shemen, is the same letters as neshama. In the Jewish heart, in the neshama of the Jew, there's always one flask of oil that's pure. In other words, no matter how much the Jew may have engaged in inappropriate behaviors and he became defiled, but there has to be one central core point in the Jewish heart that is pure. And if you're able to find that nekudah, that point, you're able to rekindle the menorah. And from that, the menorah burns not just one day, but it burns 8 days, because there's always enormous potential within the Jew. Every Jew is a Tzelem Elokim, created in the image of God. And if you could find that Nakud, in other words, it's to say, it's not possible to destroy that central point. We say in the davening, Neshama shesat be taharahi. My neshama is pure. Everybody is able to say that. Even a person who unfortunately may become a rasha, an evil person in his lifetime, he could also say Neshama shesat be taharahi, because the Jewish heart always has a pure element that cannot be defiled. And that was the point that the Chedush Rim makes, that the Pach Shemen, there was one flask of oil, no matter how much the Yevanim tried to defile the soul of the Jewish people, but they weren't 100% successful. We saw the same thing with Russian Jewry. They lived under communist rule for so many years. There was not a drop of religious life in the communist state. And then all of a sudden there was a resurgence. Then there was especially after the 6-Day War, the Pintel Yid was discovered or revealed, and that created a tremendous tshuva movement within the state of Russia, even though it was an atheistic state and completely hostile to Yiddishkeit. This idea of a Pintel Yid, I think, is not only, usually we apply it in terms of a person becoming a Baal Tshuva, or turning a person around. But I think that there's another dimension or another application of this thought of a Pintel Yid, and that is, when we deal with people, oftentimes we don't see the core of the individual. We just see things that are superficial. And for that reason, it's possible, even though every Jew, or every human being for that matter, has tremendous sanctity within themselves, and there's purity, but people become engaged in disagreements, and there's hatred, and there's hostility, and there's animosity. And the reason why that's able to fester is because they don't see the Pintel Yid. They don't see the central point within the individual. The Chumash says that when the brothers decided to sell, they wanted to murder Yosef. So it said, because they were angry at Yosef, they hated Yosef, they were jealous of Yosef. It says, Vayiro oso merachok. They saw him from afar. So I once said it means, because when you're close up, when you see somebody close, it doesn't just mean logistically close. It doesn't mean that it's 5 feet away instead of 100 feet away. But it means when you're able to see the inner core of the individual, it's not possible to hate the person, because there's always so much good in the person. If you're able to see the humanity of the person, which the humanity really means the Tzelem Elokim, how could you hate a fellow Jew? How could you hate a fellow human being? But Vayiro oso merachok, they saw him. That doesn't, I don't know how far away they were standing, but they psychologically or emotionally, they were light years away from Yosef, and that justified, or that enabled them to have so much hatred for Yosef. When the brothers came to Mitzrayim, and there was a famine, and Yosef had become the ruler of Mitzrayim, Vayaker Yosef ezecho v'hem lo hikiru, the Chumash says. The brother, Yosef recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize Yosef. So there's a dual meaning. It means, first of all, they didn't know who it was. They thought he was the viceroy of Egypt. He was, but they didn't know who that he was their brother. But I think it also means v'lo hikiru. They didn't recognize who Yosef was. They had all sorts of tightness on Yosef. They thought he was out to destroy them. But lo hikiru, they didn't recognize him because they weren't able to see the Pintel Yid. And because of that, all the hatred and animosity that they had for Yosef was justifiable. Yosef treats his brothers, even when he reveals himself and he has the ability to take revenge, he treats them with great respect. Because Vayaker Yosef Ezechov, he saw the inner good of the brothers. In spite of what they did to him, he was able to see the Nekuda HaPnimis, the central point, the Pintel Yid, but they did not recognize him. So what I would like to suggest is that the reason why there are dots over Vayishlach and he kissed him, according to the second explanation of Rashi, that Esav kissed Yaakov b'leiv shalom, with a full heart, is because the point here is that Esav, at that moment, Esav saw the nekudos of Yaakov. He saw the Pintel Yid. He saw that central core point of Yaakov's humanity, of Yaakov's kedusha, of Yaakov's sanctity, of Yaakov's neshama, which is always pure, which is the Tzelem Elokim. And when he discovered that, Vayishlach, he embraced Yaakov and Vayifku, and the two of them cried, because this was a new revelation for each one of them. For 20 years, Esav was dreaming about how he's going to destroy Yaakov, and he became a monster. It's possible to make people into monsters. How did the Nazis? I was at the concentration camps. It's unfathomable. How did the Nazis perpetrate the crimes against the Jews? How did they take babies and toss them into the air and shoot them with their guns? How did they bury people alive? How did they send people to crematoriums? It's because they didn't see them as people. They were vile. They were insects, you have to mosquitoes that you have to eradicate. They managed in their evil not to see the humanity of the people that they were murdering. How did terrorists blow up a pizza shop and murder scores of people, or a hotel? How did they 9/11? How did they manage to not how they managed, but how did they have such lack of feeling that they murdered thousands of people in one fell swoop? It's because they didn't see the central point. They didn't see it was from a distance, from afar. So you're able to, in their minds, these people were evil villains, and therefore they stripped them of all their humanity. But at that moment that Yaakov and Esav encountered each other, even though Esav had lived with so much hatred for Yaakov for so many years, but at that moment because Yaakov appeased him and he showed him brotherly love. So Esav remembered, we were twin brothers. We were at one time, we were so close. So those feelings were revived within Esav, and he saw the nekuda, he saw the central point of Yaakov, and therefore he embraced him and kissed him. And the lesson here that I want to leave you with is that so often in our relationships with people, there is hostility and there's anger and there's machlokes, and people hate each other. And the reason why, the platform which allows the hatred to fester and grow is v'lo hikiru. It's because they don't see the dots. They don't see the central core. They don't see the neshama shenasata be tahorihi. It's v'lo hikiru. People don't recognize each other. They just see things that are superficial. It's like, a good mashal is, I have difficulties, I'm sure you're the same with you. I don't recognize people anymore, but because people are wearing masks. I saw somebody yesterday. I spent 3 hours with this person in his office, and then I went to daven mincha, and after mincha, I see this guy with a mask. I had no idea who he was. He was that same person that I just spent 3 hours with. When there's a mask, you don't see the person. And that's even when there's no mask. The physical dimensions of the human being mask the inner content, the neshama, the spirituality, the purity. It's masked. And that's what allows machlokas to fester. And that's why people dislike each other, and people get into arguments, even in families and spouses. It's because they don't see the inner core. And Hanukkah teaches us that tremendous lesson, that there's always a pach shemen, there's always a nekuda, there's always a point of beauty and purity within a human being's soul. And we must not allow ourselves to that should be obscured, and that when we kiss each other, it's like the first explanation of Rashi, it's insincere, and we say hello, and it's just platitudes, and we're polite. We have to be able to see, the second explanation, the inner Nakuda, and in that way we'll be able to relate to every single Jew and every human being with the dignity that they deserved.